So Ben, thank you very much indeed for joining us for Tech the New Era. I do appreciate it. I know you've been extremely busy recently as well in terms of the home testing for COVID in conjunction with Imperial College. Tell us a little bit about the latest information from that study. What's the kind of incidence of COVID in the United Kingdom at the minute, and how many people are kind of symptomatic?
So in terms of having the actual disease, the figures we have up till mid-July are around 8 in every 10,000 people actually had the disease. But the vast majority of those people hadn't shown any symptoms at all in the week leading up to their test. So not very many people have it, and most of them aren't exhibiting any symptoms, which in some ways is both good and bad. I think what's really interesting about it is that public concern, which we're also measuring, isn't going down anywhere near as fast as the actual prevalence of the disease, and indeed the number of infections and unfortunately, of course, deaths. So people have got, in some ways, an excess of caution.
So do you think then that the government's communication program has almost been too successful? You know, it's put the fear of God into, or fear of COVID.
Well, yes, we locked down. Most people, of course, say that we locked down too late, and I'll leave that to others to decide whether or not that's true. But that's certainly the public perception. But the initial government communications campaign was very effective, and 9 out of 10 people in Britain said that they thought it was clear. More recently, that figure has fallen down to about 55%, 56%. And partly that is just that it is a more nuanced situation now. But I think what's clear, looking at the number of British workers who've gone back to work compared to, say, France or Germany or Italy, is we're much lower. So we do appear to be exhibiting, we're just basically being very cautious in many, many ways. And how that plays out this autumn and its impact on the economy. And of course, we've already seen the biggest drop in our economic in GDP compared to other similar countries in the last quarter. So how it all works out is going to be really, really interesting. But at the moment, I think people like me as a CEO, I have a sort of duty to a certain extent to encourage some, but not all, but some of my staff to start coming to the office. I'm here today and it's virtually deserted.
Yeah, and I think that's the picture pretty much across most, certainly the service sectors, and London's pretty deserted. My son sent me some photographs the other day of when he was cycling around on a Boris bike. I'm not sure if we should call them Boris bikes any longer. But, it was pretty much a deserted city still, isn't it? It's.
I think this where people live. People are going out, and and it is true that the Eat Out to help out the 11 million people have gone out and had meals and used those schemes across Britain as a whole. Rishi Sunak is the most popular politician in Britain. But no, I think the office areas, places like the City in London, still very, very low footfall. And indeed, you can see retail chains like Pret closing branches in those places. What this means longer term is just, I think, not clear. And one thing I would say while we're talking about the future and changes as a result of the disease is we do need to be cautious about making amazing forecasts and predictions, for the simple reason that in every field, forecasts and predictions are usually wrong. Opinion polls are very accurate, but you have to get to about 3 days before the election before perfection sets in. And when it comes to forecasting what's going to happen to the future of office space, the future of cities, in many ways, we're too close to the trees, really, to see the forest. We think that people are all going to fundamentally change their lifestyles and behaviours forever. And I looked at some data recently, going back to from 2019, looking at attitudes and how they'd changed in Britain on things like technology and just lifestyle back to the late 20th century, so 20 years of data. So pre-Facebook, pre the big crash of 2008, pre the war on terror, and interestingly, pre-WhatsApp, pre-everything, the proportion of people 20 years ago who said that they felt overwhelmed by technology was identical to today. The proportion of people 20 years ago who felt that to get on in life, you had to be successful in your career and that was going to give you fulfillment, identical today. The proportion who feel that technology is destroying our lives, identical to today. So we need to be careful about saying that, a few months of this admitted massive shock and change to our behaviours is going to lead to fundamental long-term change. I think it will, but I think we need to be careful.
I think the change in the enforced change in working patterns, the fact that people had to move home and work from home, particularly in the service sector. Obviously, there's a lot of people, a lot of sectors beavered away regardless because they kind of had to, particularly in manufacturing and so on, food production. But certainly in the service sector, people were forced to work from home and use tools that were available to them for probably a decade and more, but they'd never really used effectively before. But it must, I would imagine, and maybe your survey data is revealing this already, it must have resulted in a fundamental change on the nature of how business can be done in the service sector, and therefore it must be causing people to question whether indeed offices are required longer term to the extent that they have been previously.
No, well, I mean, I think what we can say, and I would say, is that where there was something that was already happening and has been accelerated by the virus, that is very likely to stick. And so, you know, that we've got more growth, for example, in e-commerce in the last few months than we've had in the previous 6 years in the UK as a percentage of retail sales, even though the overall volume of retail sales has fallen. So, and people are, you know, millions of people trying e-shopping, banking for the first time and finding out that it works. Millions of people using video conferencing with their families for the first time and finding out that it works. That is very likely to stick. And similarly, I do think that we've discovered, I mean, I have a company of 1,500 people, and we discovered that we could work very successfully without our office, at least for quite a few months. Although I think after a while, you start to discover why you did have an office, but that's a separate matter. But no, absolutely. I think there will be at least 20% of the workforce who used to go into an office every day will stop doing so now, and they will discover that they don't need all that time and grief of commuting, that they're more productive. But I think on the other hand, there are reasons why we had offices, not always the ones we originally ascribed to them, and we will need to think about how that works, particularly for how you build a culture, training people, how you get serendipity and collaboration. Some of that, I think, still needs face-to-face, or at least much better tools than we currently have, wonderful though Zoom is.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're as good an example of a professional services firm as any. You know, it's all about the intelligence of your people, the fact that you're managing what are often very complex projects where people have to get together and bounce ideas off. I mean, even when you're designing a questionnaire, you know, for a survey, you know, it's that peer bounce back is so important.
But I think it's been interesting that when we do need that, and it's just those, what I found is it's small conversations that you wouldn't necessarily set up a Zoom call for, you wouldn't necessarily send an email about, but it's just intelligence or information that you would pick up just by walking past somebody's desk or chatting about a situation that had occurred recently, and somebody will tell you something. And when I find this as a CEO, you know, I know what's going on, but it's only really those happenstance conversations that give you some of the nuance about a particular challenge or an issue. And it's very hard to recreate that. But at the same time, we found that doing workshops, for example, with clients, or indeed with the general public, now that with some of the tools available, and, you know, remember there were millions of hours of person time spent on aeroplanes, commuting around the planet to get people together into hotel rooms or, you know, function rooms to talk about things. And actually, we found that in many ways, some of these tools make us as or more productive or even better in terms of getting ideas and brainstorming. So there are definitely some positives to it. And I think, you know, I'm sure that international business travel will take a very long time to go back to the volume that it saw in 2019, because we've just realized we didn't really need to fly there now for that meeting. We just, you know, most of the time you just didn't need to.
You do also a huge amount of social research. Do you have any sense of how, you know, obviously there's an impact on business and the use of offices and so on we've discussed, but in terms of the social consequences, not just of lockdown, but also lack of engagement and lack of social interaction. Do you have any sense, again, from your data as to how the nature of the UK population is changing?
Sure. No, I mean, I think mental health has come into sharp relief, and around half the public say that they've experienced some kind of mental health problem, big or small, perhaps as a result of lockdown. And I think, I mean, we're seeing, of course, the inequality that was one of the features, and there's varying sorts of inequality, but it was one of the features of the post-2008 crash, if anything, being exaggerated by the consequences of the pandemic and our response to it in terms of lockdown. So, you know, people like me, nice house, can work from home safely, not put on furlough, you know, it's all fine. Some of the people who work for me sharing a kitchen, nowhere to work. And then, of course, we've got all those people doing those low-paid jobs in care, in retail, cleaning, etc., who have had to work throughout this. And also there's an ethnic dimension to it. We've found today in other results that we've released that if you're black, 17% of black people have got, that we've tested, have antibodies to the virus. The figure for white people is 5%. And the reason they've got it is partly living in big cities and also in multi-generational households. But it's also just being, by nature of your employment, being forced to go out and confront the virus. So these are real and dramatic changes. And the risk is, particularly with the recession that is now coming, that, you know, this is going to be, you know, part and parcel of an even more unequal Britain. And even before lockdown, we had a massive drop over the last decade in the proportion of people in this country who believed that there was an equality of opportunity. It broadly halved between 2010 and 2019. Even before lockdown, we had 45% of people in Britain who believed that their children were going to be poorer than them. The figure before the great crash of 2008 was only 12%. So it's gone from 12% to 45%. This is even before the consequences of COVID and the recession were clear, expecting their kids to be poorer. And the consequences of that in our politics and our society, we don't know yet. I mean, populism really is, to me anyway, is in part a product of the Great Recession of 2008, but it wasn't clear immediately after 2008 that was going to happen. It took some time to work through the system. And so, as I say, we're too close to the trees in many ways to see the forest that results from COVID-19 and the recession following it.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the economic impact in terms of, for example, unemployment, we're still not clear which parts of society are going to be impacted most.
Absolutely. And there will be all sorts of knock-on consequences. And, you know, it's not just the people who are directly affected, but then, of course, all the things that they were supporting in the economy that will also, you know, suffer. So no, we don't know. It looks really tough. And when I look back at the 2008 recession and the GDP figures, you know, the fall was only, you know, I think between 2 to 4% in 1 year. And I think most people are averaging at least 10% for Britain this year. And it took 4 years to get back to the same level of GDP after 2008. So with this bigger fall, yes, the bounce back may be fast, but I think it's going to be years before some sectors return to the same level of activity they saw in 2019.
Yeah, in fact, we interviewed a couple of days ago Daniel Lacalle, the Spanish economist, who was of the view that this was definitely an L-shaped recovery, and the foot of the L is going to be very, very long. He certainly didn't think it was going to look anything like the Nike swoosh.
No, sadly.
What about London? And big cities generally, but particularly the city? London is the economic powerhouse of the United Kingdom, and yes, it has been able to, you know, maintain productivity, and a lot of the trading houses, the financial trading houses, have been able to work and operate very effectively. But can a city like London, which is obviously underpinned with you know, capital growth and property valuation growth, it's got that huge civic society around it, and the, you know, catering businesses and logistics and all of that. Can London survive this massive impact?
No, London will survive. I mean, it's gone through you know, things like World War II, which are far worse than COVID-19. So London will survive. How, you know, what it will mean for property prices or the nature of some. I'm sitting in a large office development in Wapping, which is virtually empty, and my rent review was meant to be due this year. the Malaysians who bought this building a number of years ago have gone very quiet about the rent review, which was going to cost me millions of pounds. It may be that when I get to it, I'm able to argue that the rent ought to go downwards. So I don't know what that's going to mean, but we'll see about that in due course. I hope they're not listening. But no, I think it's not clear. I mean, there's millions of young people struggling to buy property in London, facing commutes that they didn't enjoy. How many of those decide that they can live further out, get more space, have a better quality of life, and just come into the office once or twice a week for some meetings and collaboration? I think that's certainly a possibility. As I say, I think we need to be careful about making dramatic assumptions. And people like cities. I live by Clapham Common. It is packed with people at the weekend, socialising, hanging out together in a way that you didn't see where I grew up, which was a smaller sort of rural city in England. So I think there's still a thing about cities and people wanting to be together, but certainly we're going to see people are living further away, I think, and that pressure on prices and property in the inner city is going to change. It may be in a positive way. We don't know yet.
I did an interview earlier with a chap who runs a law firm in the city of London. He was saying that when David Cameron came up with the idea of Tech City, the Tech City initiative, which was all about the creation of Shoreditch. The amount of investment that was coming, tech investment that was coming into the UK was like 100 million. Last year it was 10 billion. But it was very much pinned around that sort of tech community in Shoreditch, Hoxton, Old Street area. There was a recent article in Wired saying, that the whole concept of tech being pinned to a location is now gone. That can't happen any longer. But do you think it's more an idea, but can tech?
I mean, in theory, it could be done virtually, and people could, there was even the mayor of Venice at one point was trying to promote. It's a city I love. Was trying to promote the city as a relatively cheap place for well-paid tech workers to go and live. And he'll have high-powered broadband there, and they can all live in a beautiful city, pay taxes and have a great lifestyle, etc. But I think there is something. I think there is something about, if we look at Britain, and I'm going to speak as a Brit now, there is something about culture. There is something in national characteristics. People flock from all over Europe to work in London before the pandemic because they like the freedom. Because, for example, if you're an Italian woman and you want a job in Italy, it's virtually, it's really difficult if you don't know the right people and you aren't prepared to put up with, and you have to put up with certain aspects of the culture. The relative meritocracy and openness of London society has been a huge beacon. Now, what exactly happens when people don't meet as much physically, I don't know. But I think the attractiveness of London is still there. And I think it's too soon to write it off, quite frankly. I think there's still lots of things about the mixture of people, etc. People still want to meet. They still want to go to restaurants, even if they're feeling, a bit more anxious about it. And so let's see. But certainly, there is a recession on, and spending is going to be more limited. And you're seeing these peripheral areas of London potentially busier than the centre. So there is a sort of rebalancing, and there may be a rebalancing in the British economy, which could be good for Britain. I mean, before the election, before COVID, we were talking about, the left behind parts of Britain, the Labour seats in the north that gave Boris Johnson his victory, the red wall seats, which lent him their votes because they were fed up at being neglected as they felt it by metropolitan Labour or anything else. Now, does COVID give us an opportunity to rebalance and redevelop some more peripheral places because we can use technologies like the one we're talking about today to get things done? Possibly, but I think there is still something about Britain and technology and our creativity, our sense of humour, which are those are the national characteristics we ascribe ourselves, and we are good at content and media and some aspects of technology. And I wouldn't see that disappearing. And I still think fundamentally cities have survived for thousands of years because we like being together. And until COVID-19, technology wasn't showing any signs of stopping urbanization.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you. Music to my ears. And of course, we still are seeing huge increases in investment in certain segments, and some have been very resilient. Cybersecurity, in particular, huge increases in investment there. Just one final question I have to ask you. In terms of the political effect of, we obviously Boris won a huge majority in the House of Commons in the last election. Your election predictions were spot on, by the way. And
thank you very much.
But in terms of the ramifications politically, what's your polling indicating?
Sure. I mean, basically, it's not. So, obviously Labour is under new management, but Boris Johnson's popularity has drifted down during the crisis. All Western leaders, including Donald Trump, for a short time, saw a surge in run to the flag. A sort of run to the flag phenomenon where during times of crisis support for governments rises. It's something we saw in 9/11, we saw it in 7/7, and it happened again in this crisis in Britain. Boris Johnson's ratings and the government's ratings shot up. People like Angela Merkel and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand have seen absolutely astonishing scores. Boris Johnson's scores have drifted down, but they're still they're still better actually than at the time of the general election. He's still ahead in the polls, and although Keir Starmer has begun to detoxify the Labour Party, his challenge is that he's still got big problems in proving relevance, and unfortunately, roughly the same proportion of people disagree that Labour under Keir Starmer is ready for government, as disagreed that Jeremy Corbyn was. I mean, it's improved a bit, but nowhere near him to think that he's got any chance of winning in 2024. And the mathematics of the seats in 2024 mean the only way Labour would win in 2024 would be with a sort of 1997 type event. And that, at the moment in the polls at least, doesn't look very, very likely. It's early days for Keir Starmer. His personal rate, he's got as many people satisfied with his performance as Boris Johnson does. Boris Johnson has many more who are dissatisfied. The challenge for Keir Starmer is that 5 times more people have yet to make their minds up about him. And so when you ask a straight who would make the best prime minister, he's still well behind Boris Johnson. And remember, at an equivalent sort of period, shortly after the 2010 election, Ed Miliband was 12 percentage points ahead of David Cameron. Currently, when you look at a head-to-head voting intention poll in Britain, despite all of the problems the government has had, the Conservatives are 8 points ahead of Labour. So, there's no reason. I was asked by an American newspaper this morning, doesn't it mean that, Boris Johnson's going to have to stand down and there'll be a new Tory leader ready for 2024? Well, there is nothing in the polling at the moment that would suggest that had to happen, to be quite honest. It's a massive uphill struggle for the Labour Party right at the moment.
Ben, it's been fascinating as always. It's always a pleasure to talk. And listen, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you once again.
Well, let's see what happens. I mean, I think that's the thing. The key challenge to us all is to make our organisations flexible and adaptable for the very unknown and uncertain period we're all now entering. Thank you.
I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you once again.